Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Always exciting to see that attendee list start to populate once we click the go button on our end. We'll just give it another minute or two just to let everyone sign in. I know there's always a few technical issues with Zoom, with registrations and finding the link and so forth. So we'll get started right around 7:01, 7:02 p.m. just to make sure everyone is here. It is a gorgeous night, but there is no hockey game this month, unlike last month. So thank you to the Leafs for not having a game tonight. Though it is a gorgeous evening out there, but I appreciate everyone joining us as we continue our Oshawa's automotive story this evening. Looks like we have quite a number of returning Zoomers tonight. Thank you all for joining us once again this month. We've been doing these talks. We started back in December, so this is our 7th Zoom talk. So if you made it to all 7, congratulations. Really appreciate you tuning in for these. If you didn't, many of our former talks are actually on YouTube. So you can check out our YouTube page for more information on that. I believe it's under GM Curator, but you can also search for the former topics. So definitely all of our talks related to the Oshawa story are available there on YouTube.
As a reminder, if you have any questions or comments during the process, feel free to use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. And if they're small things, we can get to them possibly during the presentation. But if they're big sort of subject matter questions, we'll have a big old Q&A session at the end. Thank you all for coming.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. So let's officially get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again. My name is Alex Gates, and I'm the Executive Director and Curator at the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa, Ontario. And on behalf of everyone at the museum, I'm glad you're able to join us tonight as we share Canada's automotive heritage. We once again have people joining us from across Canada and the United States, and even further abroad as well often. Now, to begin with, let me cover a few technical details. We're using a Zoom webinar platform this evening, so as participants, you're able to see us and the presentation, but all of your cameras and sound are off on your end. So if you're still finishing dinner, or if you're watching this from your pool, we're not going to notice. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A, and we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the talk. Now, Rachel, who's our automotive librarian, will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the evening. If there's something we aren't able to get to, you can certainly follow up with you after the talk with the email address that you used to register. We are recording this talk, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel next week, and a link will be available in early July via the monthly newsletter, I should say. So if you have any questions this evening, do feel free to throw them into the Q&A at any point, and we'll be consolidating and getting to those at the end. Now, following this talk, you're going to receive a survey on this event and a link to register for next month's talk on July 15th. Now, unfortunately, the link actually isn't totally live yet. We're still working out some of the details, but it will take you to our events page, and as soon as we have those loaded in the next few days, you'll be able to register for our final talk of this series. Now, on July 15th, we're excited to have Sandor Kazar, who is the Vice President of GM Canada, and he's going to be wrapping up our Oshawa series by discussing the present and future of the Oshawa Assembly Plant. So tonight we're going to go up till about 2019, 2020, and then we're going to hear what Oshawa and the Oshawa Assembly has been doing for the last 2 years or so, and also what their plans are for the future. Now, we'll be taking August off as we expect the museum to be reopened. Fingers crossed, we're going to be reopening in stage 3, which is anticipated to be about 5 weeks from now. But we're going to be launching our 2021-2022 series with none other than Malcolm Bricklin himself in September. He's going to be joining us for a Q&A to not only talk about the famous Bricklin automobile, like the one that we have on display in the gallery, but also to talk about his new ventures in electric cars. So it's going to be covering numerous topics that evening, and it should be a fantastic start to our third Thursday lecture series for our next fall and winter series. Finally, I want to thank everyone who made a donation to the museum as part of your registration. there are a number of costs that we incur with Zoom and other software programs that we use to run these events, so I really appreciate your support, particularly while we remain closed to the public during COVID-19. And we have been closed all the way since Christmas, so it's been quite a long time, and we can't wait to reopen the museum and see you all once again. Now, this evening, I'm joined by Dumaresq de Pencier, who is our Special Projects Coordinator at the Canadian Automotive Museum. We've been talking about Oshawa's automotive history for several months now. We began with its origins in the 19th century and early 20th century back in March, where Dumaresq and I covered Oshawa's automotive community Part 1, as we're calling it now. That took us up to the early 1930s. Then Lisa Terich from the Oshawa Museum spoke on the strike of 1937 in April, followed by Jeremy Blowers from the Ontario Regiment Museum, covering the Second World War and vehicle production in Oshawa in May. Now tonight, we're going to continue our narrative from 1945 until 2019. Now this is an absolutely huge story with literally tens of thousands of people involved. So we'll be covering just the highlights over the next 40 minutes or so. From here, let me turn it over to Dumaresq, who will begin our story tonight with the resumption of civilian car production in 1945. And just a reminder that those previous 3 talks are all actually available on YouTube. So if you want to really binge on Oshawa's automotive history, you can watch several hours in a row of this whole story coming together. So Dumaresq, I'll turn it over to you to start up our story once again.
Yeah, so welcome everybody, and let's get going. As Alex had mentioned, General Motors of Canada restarted vehicle production in 1945 with the end of hostilities in the Second World War, and they did so with a fair bit of media fanfare. They announced this sort of whole new redesigned line of cars, lots of like big new peacetime stylings for this post-war world. Without actually telling anybody that the cars they were selling and building were the 1942 models with some new hood ornaments and a few other decorative styles. But things were generally pretty good at the plant. Sales were high. Gas ration and tire rationing had been canceled, so people were buying cars and updating their vehicles. The new workers' contract that had been signed in 1943 had actually officially recognized the United Auto Workers Local 222 as the bargaining agent for Oshawa Auto Workers. So generally speaking, things were hunky-dory both for the company and the people who worked there. There was a sort of small strike. It lasted about 2 weeks in 1949. You can see some images there from Local 222 on the right of strikers. That was over some assembly line rate increases. But other than that, sort of the immediate post-war period was generally a pretty calm and prosperous time for everybody involved, until give or take 1951, as we'll see in the next slide. So the company was rocked by a fairly substantial legal scandal in the United States when the United States Department of Justice actually filed an antitrust lawsuit, not against General Motors directly, but against DuPont Chemical. So they'd had a controlling share in General Motors since give or take, I believe, about 1918, 1919. And they've been using their sort of political influence within the company to ensure that, among other things, General Motors basically exclusively purchased tires from DuPont subsidiaries. This was essentially muscling out the competition, forcing price undercutting that was illegal by US business law. And over the course of the several years long court case and the subsequent sort of fallout and negotiations and hearings with the United States Senate, it became clear that on the Canadian side of things, Sam McLuhan, president of General Motors Canada, was not directly involved with anything actively criminal, but it was pretty clear that he had known that something was up and had done nothing to stop it. There was sort of correspondence from him from 1921 or so, basically saying, DuPont has asked us to only use DuPont tires, and we think that's in the best interest of the company. So he quietly stepped down from his position as president of General Motors and started selling off his stock. But this sort of led to this kind of bizarre calm before the storm, where the company was involved in all these hearings, but none of this had been made public yet. So things continued pretty much business as usual until 1953, as we'll see in the next slide. In this sort of weird downtime, things did really well. This is the start of the sort of 1950s economic boom. The company was doing better than it ever had been, as manifested by the construction of their South plant, which still to a degree exists to this day. So this really marked the beginnings in 1953, 1954 of the sort of current industrial landscape that we see in Ottawa, where everything is sort of fairly far south, south of the highway, close to the lakefront. And as this sort of new facility came online, many of the older facilities that it was replacing or superseding were either scaled back or demolished or switched over from, say, car production to parts production. And they'd remain open until about the 1970s, but we'll talk about that later. So in 1953, Oshawa Assembly produced 220,000 cars, a record for them at the time. But this was immediately followed by a fairly substantial sales slump in 1954 and 1955 for several reasons, chiefly the political fallout from the lawsuit. The company was on the back foot. Workers' contracts were due to be renegotiated in 1954. And largely because of this and because the fairly extended rate of inflation going on in the United States at the time, the workers of Oshawa struck for a pay increase in what would become known as the famous or infamous strike of 1955. So on the 15th of September, 1954, Oshawa workers walked off the job, formed picket lines, business as usual, not realizing that what would follow would become certainly probably the most important labor event in the city's history, and definitely the longest and most grueling strike. This came at a time where the rest of the United Auto Workers Union was really trying to sort of centralize and clamp down its control over its constituent members, especially those north and south of the American borders. So there wasn't really much direct support, especially direct financial support for Local 222 in this activity. Their funding ran out, I believe, in about 3 weeks. And the union had to kind of scrounge and scrape for sources of revenue to support its many thousands of members at this point. Among other things, they set up a traveling variety show called the Picket Line Review with, can dancers and clowns and jugglers that toured all over Southern Ontario and the Northern United States, raising funds and awareness. To keep the actual picket lines going over extended periods of time, and often in terrible weather, you've got to remember, this is sort of late fall, winter 1954, the 222 Women's Auxiliary actually stepped up and used their mass production skills to put together assembly line style kitchens, rotating 9-hour shifts to produce tens of thousands of, I believe, turkey and onion sandwiches to feed everybody on the picket line as cheaply as possible. With Christmas coming up in December of 1954, several of the locals, carpenters and painters and sort of skilled craftsmen were tasked with a department which was charged with refurbishing and repairing old toys, so that even those members of the union who couldn't afford to buy Christmas presents still had something to give their kids on Christmas. By the new year, everybody was exhausted, General Motors and the strikers. And there was definitely growing public support for the strike Canada-wide. And things finally came to a close. Negotiations ended on Valentine's Day of 1955, after 148 days on strike. The union won some of the concessions it had sought. They were really trying to push for better rates of pay and more control over production increases, and they got the rates of pay, but not the production increases, if I recall correctly. But what this really did was build this sort of can-do attitude, this feeling of independence that Local 222 was strong enough, and Canadian unions in general were strong enough to stand on their own against a large corporation without direct support from their original United States branches. And this kind of feeling of self-sufficiency would really define union politics in Oshawa for nearly the next 40 years. So with the sort of aftermath of the strike over, the Canadian auto market, to a degree, recovered in the late 50s, largely thanks to the first wave of baby boomers growing old enough to buy their own cars. This is sort of an era of growing interest in inexpensive and fuel-efficient cars, and sort of later on in safer cars. This is around the time when you get up to the build-up to Ralph Nader's very popular book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which reveals safety issues in the auto industry. Now, one of the vehicles highlighted, unfortunately for GM Oshawa, was the Oshawa-built Corvair, which did indeed have some safety problems, which Nader highlighted quite prominently, but to be fair to the Corvair, was definitely not any worse or any better than any of the other compact cars available at the time. But suffice it to say, in sort of this era of the VW Beetle and the small car, General Motors Oshawa, General Motors Canada in general was doing very well for themselves, but the Canadian car economy wasn't. This is really a time where Canada is starting to rack up a pretty substantial trade deficit. Despite the volume of cars being produced in the country, the vast majority of them are not really getting paid for in this country. The money that is being made on their sales is leaving Canada. And in the late 1960s, the Canadian and American governments sort of start to get together to figure out how they can deal with this, what is, by sort of 1964, about an almost $200 million trade deficit. So pretty serious money for the time. And what they come up with, as we'll see in the next slide, is a kind of revolutionary and quite controversial compromise agreement. The United States-Canada Automotive Trade Pact, or what would become known as the Auto Pact. So this is not free trade. They're very important to emphasize that at the time. The idea was that if they'd gone for full free trade in automobiles between Canada and the United States, the sheer size of the US economy would basically make Canada irrelevant and obsolete within a matter of months. So they came to like the closest they could get to free trade without actually being fully free trade. So that under the terms of the Auto Pact, and incidentally, that's Lyndon Johnson and Lester B. Pearson signing it in January 1965 at Johnson's Texas ranch, was basically that a car made in Canada by an American manufacturer could be traded freely with a big asterisk next to it. And the conditions were essentially the car had to have a minimum percentage of Canadian-made parts. It had to be made by an established auto manufacturer, and to be qualified as an established auto manufacturer, well, first you had to already have a Canadian branch in place. You had to commit to funding that Canadian branch substantially, and you had to commit to a pretty hefty buy-in fee of give or take another $200 million per company to basically wipe out Canada's retroactive trade deficit. That really has caused a lot of controversy in the United States, because it's basically boiled down the American side to paying Canada a vast sum of money for free trade on cars. But on the Canadian side, it was an immediate success. Car production, local income, and worker wages spiked almost immediately. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Canada started exporting more cars than it was importing. Good example of this, if we look at the stats, in 1969, General Motors Canada produces 100,000 more cars, just GM cars, than the entirety of Canada, every single automotive manufacturer in Canada had produced in 1959. So this is a time of great strength, both for the company and, of course, for the union and its employees. Pay had never been higher, employee benefits never been more substantial, and Local 222, largely as a result of the 1955 strike, had really become a major player in UAW's politics, both north and south of the border. They were heavily involved in supporting strike actions and sort of labor negotiations with several local subsidiary unions. Strongly involved in the 1970 General Motors general strike that affected auto workers in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Also, the 1975 Canadian industrial walkouts to protest the Trudeau government's wage and price controls. But they also had a really huge social impact. They were strongly in support of pay equality for women and encouraging the presence of women in the workplace. And they really sort of built an environment of strong political activism that really defined Oshawa's political scene well throughout the 1970s and 80s. We can, look, for instance, at local politicians like Ed Broadbent, later head of the NDP, who sort of grew up in this very pro-union atmosphere. The UAW and Local 222 very much were not necessarily founding members, but founding supporters, shall we say, of what is now the New Democratic Party, and certainly the organizations that became the New Democratic Party in the 1960s. And as all this is going on, as the company is booming, as the union is booming, a piece of Oshawa history, or a person who represents a piece of Oshawa history, is comfortably enjoying his retirement, as we turn our lens back to Colonel Sam. On the next slide, who you will recall had retired as president of General Motors of Canada in 1951. He still maintained his honorary role as chairman of the board, though, and it actually technically wasn't until 1966 that he sold off the last of his company stock. But he really threw himself wholeheartedly into sort of building a public image for himself as a philanthropist. His wife, Adelaide, had passed away in 1958, and she'd never really been big on the publicity side of things. It's a little unclear how much this was sort of her choice versus Sam McLuhan sidelining her, but generally speaking, it seems like she was very keen on keeping the McLuhan family affairs comparatively private. And with her death, Sam McLuhan took the opportunity to sort of throw his name around a little bit. But he made vast donations of money to an almost unbelievably long list of causes. Universities all across the country were supported by him. He funded the development of the planetarium at the Royal Ontario Museum, put a substantial amount of support towards Camp Samak, the Boy Scouts camp that he had helped found in the 1940s, which was incidentally built on land he'd owned. He donated hundreds of works of art to several art galleries, including the Robert McLuhan Gallery in Oshawa that his daughter Isabella had founded. And he became kind of philanthropic to the point where it was almost bizarre. His donations were notoriously a bit unpredictable and spontaneous. He would sort of, he'd have friends over for dinner and just give them his prized possessions out of the blue and say, take it, I don't need it anymore. And this worked on both a small scale and a large scale. Famously, he willed his entire estate at Parkwood to the Oshawa Hospital without really ever having an idea in mind of what it was supposed to be for, and neither did Oshawa Hospital. It's now, of course, a National Historic Site and beautifully maintained and restored. Strongly recommend you check it out. But he'd sort of assembled this vast collection of stuff, and he gave it away very much willy-nilly. Now, his 100th birthday in 1971 was marked by a parade of dozens of antique McLuhans through downtown Oshawa, one of which, our 1908 McLuhan Model F, is currently on loan to the museum from General Motors and is on display in our lobby when we reopen. And in January of 1972, he passed away quietly in his sleep, and tens of thousands of locals attended his funeral. It was one of the major public events of the decade. In the background, the sort of physical reminder of his legacy and his influence on first the carriage works, then the automotive works were disappearing. The last of the original McLuhan carriage works buildings were actually demolished in 1975. So, back to the factory itself. The boom years of the 1970s continue, and they continue into the 1980s. GM Oshawa hits a peak of nearly 20,000 workers. And this sort of multi-generational culture starts to form around the idea of getting into the motors. This is a genuinely really desirable career choice. It's one of the highest paying jobs really in the entire country, especially at entry level. The benefits are immense. And it is really work for life, especially if you're a skilled tradesman, and more especially if you're willing to work around the sort of unusual seasonal variances you get in car production. The company really sort of streamlined and refined its hiring process because, demand for jobs was so great. They were sort of mass processing hundreds of hires at a time for, pretty much 24/7 for decades at this point. But they were having a little bit of trouble sort of behind the scenes maintaining not necessarily regular line workers, but pools of skilled tradesmen. This is when you really start to see Japanese car manufacturers make their first sort of solid steps onto the North American auto market. And a lot of what they accomplish is done by headhunting electricians, welders, mechanics, and engineers from other better established car concerns. So this starts to be kind of a looming issue behind the scenes at GM that will slowly build over the course of the next decade. Meanwhile, on the union front, as we'll see in the next slide, things got a little bit interesting in, 1983 and 1984. In 83, the UAW was due for a regular contract renegotiation. And at the renegotiations in Toronto, things took a fairly surprising turn as Canadian automotive workers basically rejected the proposal that had been already agreed to by their American counterparts. There's an excellent National Film Board documentary called Final Offer on this that really tells the sort of gripping story of these trade negotiations. Strongly recommend you check it out. It's a really neat sort of slice or insight into the labor scene in Canada in the early 1980s. But suffice to say, the UAW had agreed to a profit sharing agreement whereby workers would get a cut of the profit made off of each car sold. Canadians, however, didn't want that. They were shooting more for better overtime pay and more restrictions on when people were required to work overtime. The discussions became quite heated. Things kind of broke down a little bit, but by the end of things, basically General Motors agreed to a separate trade deal or a separate contract deal with Canadian workers versus American workers. And this really marked the beginnings of a split between the UAW's member countries that would get worse to the point of breakage over basically less than a year. In December of 1984, the Canadian branches of the UAW voted to become independent and self-sufficient. And they were sort of officially relaunched as the Canadian Auto Workers Union in 1985. And unsurprisingly, one of the major hubs of debate on this issue was Oshawa. Local 222, as one of the more powerful branches in the country, had a lot of sway. And there was a lot of genuine worry that, if this sort of, at this point, 60 or 70 year long history with UAW was ended in Oshawa, then GM was under no obligation to maintain its prior agreements. This is an entirely new union, basically, so they would have to renegotiate everything from scratch. That didn't end up being the case, and Oshawa eventually ended up being basically overwhelmingly in favor of the motion. But suffice it to say, after this long and drawn out negotiation, Canada had its own national automotive workers union entirely separate from the United States. And meanwhile, that union is working in bigger and better facilities than they'd ever seen before. In 1986, the General Motors plant in Oshawa was partially shut down and retooled into what was then called the Autoplex, which collectively was at the time the largest auto plant in North America. I'm not sure how it stood worldwide, fairly sure we're talking like top 5 biggest car plants on Earth at the time. But it had what was called a flexible manufacturing model, the idea being that you could produce multiple different models of cars and trucks on the same assembly line at the same time, all within the same set of walls. It had a combined production at the end of almost 250,000 vehicles annually. And at the same time, on sort of a more personal level, as much as the company was upgrading, they were sort of trimming the fat to deal with this newer, more efficient manufacturing model by closing 11 obsolete American plants, thereby cutting 29,000 jobs. And behind the scenes, despite this public face of new modernity, they also built a new corporate headquarters during this time on the outside of town. But the company was really genuinely struggling with increasing competition from the Japanese brands. They were, generally speaking, a little bit more financially efficient, better able to respond to the changing car market. And they started to sort of muscle in almost directly on General Motors Canada's traditional home turf. You get a Honda plant opening in Alliston in 1986, and a Toyota plant in Cambridge in 1988. And then the 1990 recession hits, and things start to take a turn for the worse. General Motors begins a fairly elaborate restructuring program and starts shuttering less efficient factories all over North America. And one of the ones on the chopping block was, at the time, Oshawa Plant Number 2. There was a great deal of drawn-out negotiation to keep the plant open and to keep the jobs that it implied still running. But to sort of reach this compromise whereby Oshawa would stay in production required that workers abandon a lot of the sort of job stability and many of the benefits they'd had in the 1980s. Tension really mounted. The plant was actually physically occupied by workers several times. And this culminated in the first and only ever instance of employee sabotage in the city's history. Employees threw sugar and sand on 40 cars or so that were being painted, resulting in them having to be scrapped. And this made international headlines. In the end, 18 people were suspended, of whom 3 were fired. But the disciplinary hearings that resulted really set this very sort of combative, venomous tone that would really characterize labor debates in the rest of the 1990s. As the decade rolled on, General Motors sold off its fabrication plant in Oshawa in 1996, triggering yet more rounds of strikes and layoffs. And as sort of a knockdown side effect of the increasingly international nature of auto manufacturing, a series of major strikes in Flint, Michigan in 1998 caused rolling layoffs in Canada because the Flint factories supplied the parts that were assembled in Canada. So this really created a genuine sort of climate of uncertainty at basically all levels of staffing. Nobody was really sure what was coming next. Now, the 90s did end with GM genuinely being sort of leaner, more efficient, faster on its feet. But this had come really at the cost of alienating the worker base. There's this sort of general perception you see if you read lots of news articles from the time and interviews that people feel like the company is throwing money at a problem that just won't go away. And that unfortunately sets the tone for several years to come. So during the 2000s, General Motors continues to pare back in the face of tough economic times. It shifts its Canadian focus. less away or less towards vehicle construction and more towards development. It's opening up more plants in Mexico and South America at the time. There's a greater emphasis on R&D, which is a fairly big change for Oshawa, which had traditionally been a very sort of manufacturing and production focused town. They open up a substantial new research and development facility at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, which is now, I believe, Ontario Tech, that is still active and very much functioning to this day. And as things get worse and the sort of manufacturing scene changes in 2005, they end up, despite strong efforts by the union, closing Oshawa Plant number 2, costing 3,500 Oshawans their jobs. And these cuts continue through the 2000s, only being worsened by the 2007 to 2009 recession. This is a period of great uncertainty, of really a dramatic sea change in the way the industry is running in Oshawa. In 2009, in fairly dire financial straits, GM Canada receives a $13 billion US bailout from the provincial and federal governments of Canada and Ontario, obviously, which does genuinely save the company, allows them to get back on their feet, but really has a fairly strong human impact. This is a period of regular job losses, deep uncertainty for workers in Oshawa and their families. And organizations like the local 222 Social Justice Fund, which are founded in 2002, they're quite instrumental in acting as kind of a financial and community support network for this quite substantial, percentage of the city's population who had depended on the auto industry for work. But this still doesn't really change this climate of looming uncertainty and doubt that is sort of cast over the city through the mid-2000s. But I believe Alex will take over and speak more to that as we move along. Take it away, Alex.
Sure, thanks, Dumaresq. And we could certainly, I know everyone has opinions on the great bailout back in a few years ago. I think once we get into living memory, there's something about this talk that certainly changes. Now, I came on the scene in Oshawa in 2014, and I can say from personal experience, over the past decade, there's been a lot of talk here in Oshawa about the future of the Oshawa Assembly Plant. And so it's something that generally people talked about on the street on a regular basis. So what exactly is going to happen to it and when it would be closing. And so, from year to year, there were different contracts that were extended and so forth. And yeah, Rachel, if you just want to go to the next slide. And there's always that sort of discussion about when production was going to end. And so one of the interesting landmark events happened in November 2018. So actually for the 100th anniversary of General Motors of Canada being founded. So if you remember from our first talk, GM Canada was officially formed back in November, I think it was November 23rd, 1918 by Sam McLuhan and the folks Billy Durant and so forth from GM over in Michigan. And that anniversary came up, and we at the museum and others in town were thinking that's a pretty good anniversary to celebrate. And it was quite marked that GM Oshawa did not have a large ceremony for that. And in fact, within a week or so, there was the large announcement that made international headlines once again that the assembly plant in Oshawa was slated to be closed. Now, for us at the museum, I can take it from that angle right now. It was a fascinating historical turning point. As we've heard during our talks, the history of assembly of both carriages and automobiles in Oshawa is quite a story dating all the way back to the 19th century. Over 20 million vehicles have been produced in Oshawa, and this is a huge story that we set out to tell. And so this is actually where we began our Oshawa's automotive community idea for our exhibit and now our speaker series as well. And the fascinating thing is that we actually had a whole year to plan out what we wanted to be collecting, what stories we wanted to tell before the plant was actually slated to close at the end of 2019. And the end, or what we thought was the end, if we go back to 2018, 2019, there are a few things we didn't see coming in 2020. One of them being sort of the future of the assembly plant. actually, if you could just go back to the previous slide for a moment still. So the last truck's going to come off the line in December 2019. It's going to be a GMC Sierra. And thanks to the folks at General Motors, one of the things that we were able to get from this is actually photos of it going through the line. And so thanks to the staff at the Oshawa Assembly Plant, this is one of the rare instances where we suddenly got lots of pictures of actually what was happening inside the plant. One of the things you'll notice when we're doing these talks and so forth is that there aren't a lot of interior shots of the assembly plant. And that's because employees, for obvious reasons, aren't allowed to be taking photos of all the intricacies of how the plant actually operates, of the products, of the various tools they use. And so the only shots we really get, and the ones that you saw tonight in the presentation, are usually through newspapers. So when there's a major event, so if they're retooling, or if there's a new product being added or ending on the line, they would invite the local newspapers in, and they would have photo shoots and do little quotes from workers and so forth. But generally, the day-to-day that happened in the plant, even in the era of cell phones, wasn't really recorded because workers were not allowed to have cell phones on the assembly line while they were working. And so this sort of last day on the line was quite interesting because everyone had their cell phones out. So you can see on the bottom right, the last trucks coming off the line there, and people are taking photos with it. And this is a really sort of bizarre scene because this is something that just doesn't happen very often. There were, sort of tours you could take through the plant if you were a VIP or if you're there on business. But the number of press that were there and the number of workers on the line sort of watching the car, the trucks, so I should say the last two trucks come down, was quite fascinating. And then we thought it was all going to be over at that point. And so I snapped a photo on my way out, which, if you've never been in the Oshawa Assembly, it is a absolutely huge building. Just the size and scale of it, I think, is something I really want to emphasize. And particularly when it's empty, it is one very large, very creepy building to be in with that empty assembly line. But we thought that was going to be the end of it. But as we see here in 2020, that was not going to be the end of our story. And so 2020 threw us a few turns, one of which being that we're doing Zoom talks from home here during the pandemic, and the GM Oshawa Assembly continued to move forward as well. So I don't want to give away all of our July talk, but one of the amazing things that they transitioned to during this period was producing masks, face masks, medical grade face masks, to fight against the pandemic. And so they brought in the equipment, they trained employees, and they set up making face masks actually in the old assembly plant. And this is a story we've been collecting. We actually have face masks from that plant that are available. I do believe that these went directly to medical workers. They're not just ones that you would buy at the store. And so they were producing them much in the similar vein to production being shifted over during the Second World War. And we definitely never thought that the assembly plant in Oshawa would be shifting to other production very shortly after we thought this whole topic was being wrapped up nicely. We thought that we had this opportunity to have an exhibition that has a very clear start, in the 1860s with that carriage works, with the first sleigh being built here, and ending with that last car coming off the line. But that was not to be, and fortunately, there are other things happening. So here we have a picture up at Ontario Tech University of an electric Hummer. And so the future is electric. That in the future is also going to be self-driving. So a number of things have transpired in the last 2 years. The first being a big shift in electric cars and self-driving cars. So down at the assembly plant, they will be starting truck production again. We expect that in the future that's going to be electric truck and car production. But again, I'm not the expert about the future of General Motors. We'll get to that in July. But there's also the McLuhan test track. And so in honor of Sam McLaughlin's 150th birthday, which will be this September, they are naming the new autonomous test track down in South Oshawa for Sam McLuhan himself. I think he'd be very proud of that. And we're looking forward to seeing more of what comes out of the Oshawa Assembly Plant and for all of GM in Oshawa. And so aside from the assembly plant itself, there's still a large R&D component that's actually happening now in Oshawa and in Southern Ontario. And that's always been part of GM here in Canada, and definitely something we're going to see evolving very quickly in the next few years. So that's about where we're going to wrap up. Are there any more slides, Rachel? Okay. We'll end it about there. We could certainly talk about many of these topics. I know I see from our attendee list, we have quite a number of past and current GM employees from Oshawa and beyond. So appreciate any questions or comments, anything you want to throw in there. Again, we tried to keep this to a quick 40 minutes of a very long and complicated story. But again, I want to invite you to come back in July 15th, and we're going to continue telling the story of the last couple of years and into the future. So come with all your questions. I'm going to ask when they're going to make rocket ships to take us into space in Oshawa, if we're going to have a space launch pad someday. I think something like that would make Sam McLuhan extremely happy, going from carriages to cars to rocket ships. But you'll have to wait till July to ask that question. So Rachel, do we have any pressing questions so far, or rebuttals about what we said about GM Oshawa? I know it's always hard talking about recent history, as many of you were there and might have witnessed it different than the historical sources. And of course, these are the types of stories we're always looking to collect as well. If you have any great stories about working at GM, or about GM Oshawa, this is definitely an evolving exhibition, and I know myself and Dumaresq as well, we have learned all sorts of things, and more keeps coming out.
Yeah, we've had some really, really excellent talks with current and former GM employees about, day-to-day life in the plant. The Faces of GM Oshawa project especially have been incredibly helpful with hooking us up with people who are willing to talk about their experiences and their interesting and varied careers with the company and what they've sort of seen on the ground in the sort of past 2-3 decades.
We just got a question. They're asking which plant was plant number 2?
Gosh, Alex, I'm giving you this one. I don't know my Autoplex layout very well.
I don't have a map conveniently here. Maybe we can. I think we do have a slide of the map of the plant back in the 80s. So basically, there's the Autoplex was composed of the two car plants and the truck plant, is my understanding. And as Dumaresq, you mentioned the car plant. We didn't really touch on the truck plant. One of the things that's fascinating about the Oshawa Assembly as well is that almost, I believe, all of the Chevy trucks for most of the 20th century were produced solely in Oshawa at that truck plant in the later 20th century. So if you drove a Chevy truck, you were driving a Canadian vehicle likely. So I think our little map there is a little bit small, but you can sort of get an idea of the various buildings. Many of which are still standing there.
Sorry, I'm poring over my notes. I know when we were writing this exhibit 2 years ago, I had a long and detailed list of what every building did. I need to find them again. Good question. We need to do an interactive map clearly at some point.
Yes, I have a huge map layout at the museum, but unfortunately I don't have it digitized. So.
Another question that came up. They're wondering if the signing of NAFTA was a major contributor to the layoffs in the 1980s and 90s.
To a degree, yes. Though there's kind of a confusing situation where the Auto Pact and NAFTA to a degree coexisted, even though they were sort of kind of actively contradictory. Yeah, the Auto Pact technically only expired or was canceled in 2001. But as I understand it, you could ask an economist, and they could certainly probably trace a direct link between NAFTA and the changing political and sort of manufacturing system in Canada and in the car industry. But certainly from the period materials I've read and from the interviews and people I've talked to, there was not a perception that, NAFTA comes into place and suddenly the auto industry falls apart. I would say yes, it was a major contributor, but not in a direct, immediately obvious sense. That is the kind of question I could write a very long and dry essay about, but good question. Okay,
I see. Thanks to Clark for answering about plant 1 and 2. So if you're looking at the screen, plant number 1 is sort of the light blue one in the center, and plant number 2 is just to the left, which would be along Stevenson, just south of the 401. I believe, someone can correct me, that building is demolished now. They demolished it a few years ago, but I might be wrong. Or is that, no, sorry, that was the paint plant. I'm going to correct myself live on camera. So sorry, just south of the paint plant, which was torn down a couple years ago. And the GM test track is actually sort of at the south end. There used to be a battery plant down at the south end of the factory site, and that's near where the test track is now. If you're taking a ride down Park Road South, all the way down, there's a big fence around it. But we hope, fingers crossed, if anyone from GM's watching this, we'd love to have a nice little museum tour to come see the new autonomous testing facility at some point, because I think we'd all love to see what that looks like in action. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that this test track, I believe, there was no historic test track in Oshawa right there on the site. So this is new for GM Oshawa. Any other questions? Everyone's being very polite tonight. I thought we would have quite a few. Dumaresq, do you have any other fun anecdotes?
I'm trying to think. I mean, this picture, someday I would like to do a detailed, in-depth dive into the history of labor-saving devices on assembly lines. But I find it really, just as a matter of personal interest, the growing use of powered systems to minimize strain and repetitive injury on people moving large parts. As you see, this is a great shot of the tools of the plant being used day to day to heft large components. But personal preference. Jennifer Langford, sorry. Yes, sorry, I apologize. I made a typo on the Strike of 55 slide. That is entirely my fault. The Strike of 55 was, in fact, September 19th, 1954 to February 14th, 1956. I apologize for that.
55.
55, yes, gosh.
Sorry, it wasn't 2 years, but it's often known as the Valentine's Day strike.
Yes.
By locals. I don't know if that's an official name for it, but well known as the Valentine's Day strike around Oshawa, because it did conveniently end on Valentine's Day. So if you hear that term thrown around in local circles.
We have another question. At the museum, is there a display or list of all the GM cars and trucks that were built at the Oshawa plant?
I don't believe we currently have a master document. It's tough because documents exist for specific years. We could look and say, here's everything that was built at GM Oshawa in 1921. Here's everything that was built in 1936, but there's no single sort of living document that maintains that, because there's been a fabulous variety of vehicles. We're talking like hundreds and hundreds of different models of cars and trucks over the decades.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely something in terms of our research we're hoping to do a better job compiling. Yeah. It's fairly easy yeah, particularly during, the 19-teens, 1920s, anything that GM built was obviously built by GM Canada in Oshawa. Now, when we get up to, the 90s, 2000s, and so forth, those are the things we want to keep track of, particularly as we see sometimes, it's just a year or so that certain models were built in Oshawa. And these are models that were built at several other locations across North America and across the world as well. And so, unfortunately, there isn't a great list going. There's actually like a fairly decent Wikipedia page that people have contributed over the years in terms of cars built at GM Oshawa. But I will be the first to tell everyone to not trust Wikipedia in terms of what they say is produced in the world. And I know I've asked Rachel several times to go check all sorts of records upstairs because what we find on the internet just doesn't quite look right. So. But yes, that is something we're looking to, compile in the future.
I saw a comment about sort of interest in General Motors in the 1960s and 1970s, and I'd recommend to anybody who is interested. There's an excellent series of there were a large source for the sort of 1970s and 80s and 60s chunk of this exhibit as we were writing it. An excellent series of oral history interviews conducted by Carl Beveridge and Carol Condé back in, I think, 1981, 1982, where they basically sat down with several dozen plant employees from sort of all walks of life and all levels of the hierarchy, and just sort of let them talk about their stories. They're not very easily publicly accessible. They use them for sort of a strange art project, but the initial records are all freely available at Library and Archives Canada. And if you want a really sort of intimate, direct look into what was on people's minds as auto workers in the 1980s, what they talked about, their sort of day-to-day lives, their, for lack of a better word, their day-to-day drama. The transcriptions of those files make for fascinating reading, and you can request copies from Library and Archives Canada by mail or by email. They're really interesting stuff if you want to know more.
Yeah, and actually we were, one of the things we had planned out back in 2018, 2019, we were actually working with the National Science and Technology Museum in Genium on actually doing some more recent interviews. So those interviews were done back in the 1980s, and so we were able to kind of trace back stories to the founding of the Union and various events over the years. And so we're actually hoping to be working with folks in Ottawa to collect more stories from the 80s to the present. Obviously, with COVID and so forth, that project has been shelved a little bit. I know it's still on the books, and we hope to be moving forward with it when all of this is sort of sorted out. Obviously, it's a lot easier to do oral histories in person than it is to be calling people and doing Zoom calls and so forth. But I do know they are partnering with us for part of this exhibit, and there are in fact large collections and parts of this project that we haven't been able to get to yet. And just a few days ago, we received even more images and material from the GM assembly plant itself. They donated a couple boxes of photo negatives, particularly from the late 60s through the 1970s. And so we have quite a lot of new material to continue to work with as we continue to flesh out this story. So as much as we joked, we kind of had this nice bookend on this project. We're going to wrap it up, put this website up, do these talks. There's still many, many years of research and other exhibitions and other talks to come from this. And if you know of anyone who's a great speaker, please let us know. We're still continuing to collect these stories.
Yeah.
So if no one else has any other questions, I will wrap this up for the evening. Dumaresq, any last words before we go enjoy the rest of this beautiful June evening?
Oh, but well, I guess this brings us to the end of Oshawa's automotive community.
Until next time.
Until next time, absolutely. But
yes,
thank you all so much for coming.
We'll talk about the future.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. And this talk will be available on our YouTube channel next week in case any of your friends or family missed it. So thank you and have a good evening.